The Dhammapada by Bhante K.Sri.Dhammananda. Published in 1988 by the Buddhist Missionary Society, Buddhist Vihara, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Introduction. Throughout his ministry of 45 years, the Buddha, the Supremely Enlightened One, worked ceaselessly to expound the Dhamma, the truth he had realized. This he did out of compassion for the world and for the welfare and happiness of humanity. The Buddha's faithful attendant disciple, Ananda, endowed with almost superhuman powers of memory, had asked a boon that the Master would repeat every discourse that had not been uttered in the former's hearing. The Venerable Ananda has himself stated that he knew 84,000 utterances of the Buddha. There were, of course, some other disciples who were associated with the Buddha from the very beginning, and who had also memorized faithfully the sayings of the Buddha with incredible devotion. These erudite and holy disciples had a historical sense in that they recognized the importance of recording accurately not only the utterances but also the circumstances under which the Enlightened One proclaimed the various aspects of his teaching. So great was their concern for authenticity that barely 3 months after the Buddha's Mahaparinibbana, the great passing away, they held a council where the noble members of the Sangha, the consummate ones, or arahants, assembled to recite, codify, and collate the sum total of the Buddha's teachings, so that they could be handed down for posterity with no room for misinterpretation, distortion, or adaptation. The Oral Tradition. The entire teachings of the Buddha were recorded and handed down orally in an unbroken chain by the members of the Holy Order until they were finally committed to writing in Pali, Magadhi language, in 80 BCE, or before Common Era, in Sri Lanka. The teachings of the Master were publicly recited by congregations of monks so that there would be no erroneous accounts or substitution of words. However, more than the essence of the teachings have been preserved for posterity. They have recorded for us a vivid picture of the life and the preoccupations of the ordinary folk who were alive in northern India during the time of the Buddha. These folk were not very different from us. The kings, ministers, princes, Brahmins, farmers, naked ascetics, outcasts, robbers, courtiers, bankers, courtesans, husbands, wives, lovers, sons, daughters, and so forth, had the same frailties that people today are subject to, such as greed, hatred, delusion, jealousy, laziness, pride, foolishness, etc. The early Buddhists also were gentle, caring, devoted, intelligent, generous, and dedicated. The stories recorded in the Dhammapada gives us a vivid picture of the Supreme Teacher. Among the Buddha's lay disciples were kings like Bimbisara and Pasenadi, millionaires like Anathapindika, courtesans like Sirima, together with a host of ordinary citizens, barbers, goldsmiths, elephant trainers, acrobats, slaves, hunters, fishermen, florists, butchers, weavers, and boatmen. Many benefited from his teachings, Some went on their own way, unable to gain anything. The stories of the Dhammapada have touched the hearts and minds of mankind because they deal with true human feelings. They have pathos, as when Patachara lost her whole family in a series of accidents. They have humor, as when we are told that a monk who repeatedly rejoined the order had his head shaved so many times that it was like a whetting stone. They have romance, as when Nanda pines for the bride he has left behind to join the order. They have intrigue, as when the heretics employ a courtesan to accuse the Buddha of adultery, as when Magandiya successfully plots against the death of saintly queen who is a follower of the Buddha. They have politics, as when the Buddha's relatives are poised for battle on both sides of the Rohini River because of a quarrel over irrigation, and they have drama, as when Devadatta tries repeatedly to battle the Buddha for supremacy and meets a woeful end. The Buddha's compassion. The Buddha had many enemies too. His own cousin, Devadatta, unsuccessfully attempted to kill him 3 times, and rival religious leaders tried to defame him by accusing him of adultery and falsehood. But the Buddha remained in their midst, unpolluted like the lotus flower, which has come to symbolize purity in Buddhism. The Buddha was in the world, but not of the world. The Buddha's compassion knew no bounds. He had time to talk to scavengers and slave girls, and he accepted the offerings of the humblest of citizens. Once he accepted the half-finished meal of a Brahmin because it had been offered with humility, respect, and devotion. The Buddha's teaching has become a very rich doctrine because many other religious teachers had many dialogues and debates with him on the deeper aspects of controversial religious issues like the existence of a creator God, soul theory, divine power, animal sacrifice, austerity, rites and rituals, and final salvation. As a result, the Buddha personally clarified many of the controversies which are being argued about even today by those who have different beliefs. The Buddha was the greatest teacher the world has ever known. Modern educationists would do well to study his methods when they consider how to improve their skills to impart knowledge to others. Not once in the closely recorded life of the Buddha can we find an instance of his becoming angry or impatient with those who could not or did not want to understand him. There was no occasion when the Buddha spoke harshly to another person. His patience, tolerance, all-embracing compassion and merciful wisdom cannot be equaled by any other teacher. The admonition given by the Buddha in the first verse of the Dhammapada, that the human mind is responsible for everything we do, good or evil, is reiterated and embodied in the preamble to the UNESCO Charter of Human Rights, which states, "Since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defense of peace must be constructed." But the Buddha had some supreme faculties which made him greater than any other teacher. He was able to effect miraculous changes of heart and attitudes even in the most antagonistic, obstinate, dull, or weak-minded individual, because he had the infinite faculty of knowing the past lives which conditioned the peculiar behavior of a certain individual. He knew, for example, that a young bhikkhu could not meditate on the loathsomeness of the body because, having been a goldsmith in successive previous existences, he could best respond only to beautiful objects. When the teacher gave him a golden lotus, he quickly gained one-pointedness in concentration of the mind. Again, when his listeners gazed at the sky, scratched the earth, or shook a tree instead of paying attention, the Buddha was understanding because he knew their behavior was conditioned by their previous existence as an astrologer, a subterranean creature, and a monkey. The Buddha was the first teacher who recognized the importance of knowing the aptitude and psychological makeup of a learner before effective teaching can take place. That the Buddha was a peerless teacher can be proved by the fact that he did not use the same approach or method when instructing different disciples. The Buddha always suited his teaching to the age, temperament, character, status, or mental state of his listeners. He delayed giving a sermon to a congregation until a hungry cowherd was fed because he knew that a hungry man could not concentrate. There were times when he even remained silent because he knew the answers would only confuse the questioner more. As in any community, there were the very highly intelligent, like Venerable Sariputta, who was intellectually endowed to comprehend the most abstruse teachings as embodied in the Abhidhamma. On the other hand, the compassionate master used different methods for the unintelligent and unskillful, as when he instructed Chula Pantaka to simply think about mental defilements while he rubbed a clean piece of white cloth facing the east. When Kisa Gautami, distracted with grief, approached him asking for a medicine to restore her dead son, the Buddha asked her to fetch him some mustard seeds from a family where no one had died. She could not find in the village a home where Mara, or death in this case, had not stalked. Truth dawned upon her, and she realized the universality of death. Because of the Buddha's method of instruction, Kisa Gautami, the mother who had walked about clutching the dead body of her infant son, was able to realize the truth as depicted in the verse. Uninvited he came, uninformed he went. As he came, so he went. What avails weeping? The Great Books. Later disciples, who were entrusted with the task of elucidating the Dhamma, also emulated the great teacher's methods. Thus, in Buddhism we have the texts pertaining to the higher teachings, the Abhidhamma, which deal with the psychological aspects of the Dhamma for the intellectually well-endowed. Then there is the Sutta collection, which is a complete record of the lengthy, middle-range, and short discourses uttered by the Buddha, which can be read by a larger community of disciples. It is here that we witness a great part of the Buddha's teachings. In this section of the Tipitaka, or the Buddhist Canon, can be found teachings which are suitable for almost any type of human mind, and for all characters and temperaments. The Dhammapada belongs to the fifth and last section of this particular canon. This selection of the Buddha's sayings is most suited for a much wider range of people, and its stories rank among the greatest achievements of human endeavor in literature, poetry, and storytelling anywhere in the world. The third canon consists of rules of conduct, the Vinaya, and is meant solely for the guidance of monks and nuns who have joined the holy order. Along with the Jataka, or birth stories of the Buddha in his previous existences, the Dhammapada is certainly among the most widely read and quoted books in all of religious history. The culture, manners, and thoughts of whole nations have been partly shaped by the sayings in the Dhammapada over many centuries. Throughout South and East Asia, in Thailand, Burma, and Sri Lanka especially, the Dhammapada stories have been breathed into infants by doting mothers, and they have been told and retold by the most learned monks to instruct, gladden, and enlighten people from different walks of life. It is impossible to estimate how many human beings have refrained from telling a lie, killing an insect, spreading a rumor, bearing false witness, or taking what is not given, by calling to mind a story from the Dhammapada at the right moment. If the world has experienced moments of compassion and wisdom in the face of greed, hatred, and delusion, the Dhammapada must be given its due share of credit for it. In the footsteps of the Master. The Buddha is known as the foremost among men in view of the fact that he attributed all his attainments and achievements to human endeavor and human understanding. He pointed out to an ailing humanity a path that leads to final deliverance and nibbana, namely the path or morality, sila, concentration or meditation, samadhi, and true wisdom or insight, panya. This is called the threefold training, Tividha Sikha. Following the footsteps of the Master, his disciples, who were the early Buddhist teachers, instructed the people to practice the threefold training. These teachers made full use of the Dhammapada verses to instruct the people according to their temperaments and aptitudes. These stanzas were also meant to be a valuable guide and easy reference work for teacher monks who were looking for a suitable subject to discourse upon. Even today, it would be most difficult for any speaker or writer to discuss Buddhism without some reference to the Dhammapada. The Buddha never claimed to have invented or created the Dhamma which he taught. Like the Buddhas before him, he removed the ignorance which prevented man from perceiving the ultimate truth, and he showed the way to this truth. Therefore, some of the truth which he uttered through these verses are also contained in the scriptures of other religions. Roy C. Amor, in his book Two Masters, One Message, quotes the following: "One cannot read the Sermon on the Mount without feeling that it is an abridged version of parts of the Dhammapada, Somatera, the contribution of Buddhism to world culture." The more teaching of the Buddha has a remarkable resemblance to that of the Sermon on the Mount. B. H. Streeter, The Buddha and the Christ. To love one's enemies, to bless them that curse, to do good to them that hate, to turn the other cheek, to leave the cloak with him who takes the cloak, to give all to him who asks, which are the teachings of Jesus, are precepts not only taught but practiced in their extreme rigor by the Buddha. Dr. S. Radhakrishnan, Eastern Religion and Western Thought. The Bhagavad Gita and the Tirukkural are Hindu works in Sanskrit and Tamil languages of great antiquity. The former is an ancient work of literature, and the latter was composed just before the Christian era. But both contain many of the truths which are expressed in the Dhammapada. Hence, the Dhammapada may be considered to be a work that reaches out to all of humanity, which underscores our common heritage on this earth. The Dhammapada transcends narrow sectarian loyalties. It is indeed a book for all mankind. Mythology, legend, or exaggeration? The reading, understanding, and appreciation of the Dhammapada in its classical form generally presents no difficulties to traditional Buddhists who are familiar with the cultural milieu in which it was composed. However, modern readers, especially those who come from non-Asian religious backgrounds, may be skeptical and wonder whether the stories which relate to circumstances under which they were uttered represent actual historical occurrences, or whether they are merely fanciful folk tales imagined by their authors. They would find some of the stories trivial, repetitious, and even far-fetched. It is true that some of these stories are not completely free from mythology, legend, and exaggeration. Possibly the best attitude to adopt is to keep an open mind and concern oneself more with the moral of the story and the point that is being illustrated. In this connection, Jawaharlal Nehru, the late Premier of India, has commented in Discovery of India that people waste a lot of time arguing about the authenticity of stories. They should rather try to understand the message that these stories are intended to convey. It would also be good to remember Hamlet's remark to Horatio in Shakespeare's play. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in thy philosophy. What is important and significant in this book are the sayings of the Buddha, the verses. Without the verses, the accompanying stories are meaningless and ineffective. Their primary purpose is to relate the incidents which prompted the Buddha to utter the stanzas. We should, however, not quibble about the authenticity of the actual stories, but consider the psychological impact they will have on the devout listener who receives the message with devotion and confidence, saddha. For example, we should consider how these stories create moral shame and moral fear, and also aversion to hate, anger, greed, jealousy, lust, and so on. In traditional Buddhist communities, these stories, which are heard from an early age, form an effective means of molding one's character and in inculcating the virtues of love, compassion, generosity, equanimity, and so on. In any case, even skeptics would agree that these stories can be enjoyed for their own sake, whether they are authentic or not. In the next section, we will attempt to explain some of the problems which will present themselves to uninitiated readers. Guidelines for the reader. Almsgiving. Perhaps the first question which would present itself to an uninitiated reader is the constant reference to the offering of food to the Buddha and his disciples by their lay supporters. Why is there so little reference to feeding the poor, for example? According to the Buddha, charity in the form of giving to the needy is indeed praiseworthy and is certainly encouraged. There are numerous stories in some other Buddhist books which tell us how important it is to support the poor and the needy. Anathapindika, the philanthropist, supporter, and disciple of the Buddha, was one of them. His very name means feeder of the poor or refugees. Members of the community of monks, however, are the teachers of the Dhamma, and by enabling them to lead a pure and noble life, the lay devotee is helping to sustain the essential teachings. Sustaining the custodians of the Dhamma is considered a more meritorious undertaking than merely feeding the hungry. Therefore, Buddhist devotees, while supporting the needy, tend to pay more attention to providing requisites to religious and holy people so that these holy men can concentrate solely on the development of purity and doing some service to the public. Those who have renounced to seek spiritual development are not actively concerned about their personal needs, and it is the duty of the devotee to care for them. In this way, the lay devotee is partaking in spiritual activities on a larger scale. The offering of food and other requisites is traditionally followed by the giving of a sermon by the monks on some aspect of the teaching, which will help the listener in his quest for understanding and wisdom. Helping the poor ensures one's physical well-being, but sustaining the spiritually well-endowed creates the environment for spiritual development, which is the Buddhist ideal. It must be noted that the Buddha did not encourage the support of Buddhist monks alone, but of any holy, spiritually superior being who is sincere and who teaches with right view. When Buddhist monks themselves earned bad reputations after the violation of their precepts, the Dhammapada records how certain townsfolk withdrew some support until they mended their ways. The offering is made worthy because it is done with full confidence and given with a pure mind to one who receives with an equally pure mind. The stories in this book are mainly about members of the Holy Order, which was established by the Buddha. This is natural, because renunciation was considered an important first step for anyone who was really concerned about seeking a way out of repeated existence, births and deaths. The Buddha's advice, therefore, was generally aimed at the members of the Sangha who were closely associated with him. In this connection, we may also wonder why there has been so much attention given to the robes worn by the monks. We are told about the talk generated among the monks when Devadatta was awarded a new set of robes, and about a monk who was even reborn as an insect because he was unduly attached to the robes. Here we must remember that we are dealing with the social and economic circumstances in India 2,500 years ago. There are many people who had become ascetics and who depended on the generosity of lay people for their requisites. Naturally, it was not an easy thing to receive a set of robes, and those who were spiritually backward would have experienced much jealousy when others received these requisites which were so hard to come by. It is only the Arahants who are totally unconcerned about whether the materials they receive are expensive or whether they receive anything at all. Different characters. We can only marvel at the integrity of the early Buddhist chroniclers, who did not always attempt to justify or glorify the monks who were worldlings, those who had not yet attained sainthood, but presented them with all their human weaknesses clearly. We find some of them vain, avaricious, immoral, adulterous, jealous, haughty, greedy, inconstant, dull-witted, petty, cruel, gullible, envious, arrogant, etc. But the Buddha admits them all into his order. Most of them train and mold their characters after listening to him, but some go their own way. unable to avail themselves of the opportunity they have of seeking emancipation. And the Buddha does not disparage and condemn them. Only the saints who have completely eradicated hatred, greed, and delusion are above all blame. They are the consummate ones. Sudden enlightenment. A casual reading of the Dhammapada, without understanding of the other books in the Tipitaka, may lead a reader to wonder at the apparent, almost facile ease with which the Buddha seems to convert the minds of men. How can an acrobat attain sainthood while sitting on the top of a bamboo pole? How is it that a murderer is utterly tamed by a simple remark, "I have stopped, it is you who have not stopped"? How do some people become saints instantaneously? To answer these questions, one must know something about the doctrine of rebirth. A being must be extremely fortunate to be born during the time of the Buddha. Usually, those who have accrued much merit and are almost at the point of sainthood meet the Buddha, who is instrumental in removing their final fetters, which act as mental hindrances. The fact that they were born during the time of the Buddha is no mere accident. They had accrued sufficient good karma through mental training during their previous lives, and have made strong aspirations to be delivered from samsara, worldly suffering. They also had to suffer the effects of some of the bad karma which resulted in their births as lepers or blind people, in poor or wicked surroundings, and so on. However, such unhealthy and unpleasant situations turned out in many cases to be blessings in disguise to them, because it gave them the opportunity to meet the Buddha or gaining their final deliverance. Extraordinary characteristics. The Buddha was able to effect these miracles in mind purification because he had special characteristics which are the essence of Buddhahood or supreme enlightenment. One of these is asaya anusaya jnana. Only a Buddha with his special faculty can intuit the mental hindrances which interfere with understanding of the truth. The Buddha is known as the great healer because, like any other good physician, he delves into the root cause of a disease before attempting a cure. The more accurately the cause is diagnosed, the more quickly the healing process can be effected. He has the supernormal power to assess the mental condition and the level of spiritual development in a person, and thereby take the right approach to help beings out of samsara. This is why a seemingly simple statement made to a particular individual at the opportune moment was enough to bring him to accept the right view or reality in life. We must also understand that, according to the Abhidhamma, a single thought moment lasts only a fraction of a second. Even so rapidly is a transition from ignorance to understanding effected, hence the instantaneous conversions by the supremely enlightened Master. No age limit for spiritual blossoming. One may wonder how very young samaneras or novices, some as young as 7 or 8 years old, attain sainthood while being shaved in the case of Arahant Shivali, and so on. Here we must refer to rebirth. We all know of child prodigies like Beethoven and J.S. Mill, who developed skills far beyond the capability of children of similar ages. Christian Heineken, who talked within a few hours of his birth at Lübeck in 1721, could repeat passages from the Bible at 1, answer any question on geography at 2, speak French and Latin at 3, and at 4 years of age was a student of philosophy. He died before he was 5. William James Sidis, wonder child of the United States, could read and write at 2, spoke French, Russian, English, German with some Latin and Greek at 8, and at 11 lectured on the fourth dimension to a gathering of professors. In Buddhism, this is explained as the individual having developed his potential over countless previous births, and like a young lotus bud, which blooms as soon as it comes out of the water and feels the sun's energy, so too their potential is fully realized on being provided with the necessary stimulus for sainthood. The attainment of sainthood has nothing to do with physical maturity. It is a mental and spiritual process which is developed over countless rebirths. Sudden death after spiritual achievement. The perceptive reader may also wonder why people die soon after attaining sainthood as recorded in some of the stories. This question was raised during the time of the Buddha himself. Again, the explanation lies in the Buddha's supreme faculty of pre-knowledge and extrasensory perception. Knowing that the end of some deserving being is approaching, the compassionate one visits him to provide the opportunity for the attainment of Nibbana. These more dramatic events are of course better remembered, and having good story value, are recorded for posterity. There are nevertheless ordinary mortals like the Buddha's own father, who took a longer time and who attained arahanthood in a less dramatic manner. Why doesn't the Buddha use his supernormal powers to prevent the apparently untimely deaths of some of the people in the stories? There are examples, as in the case of a child called Wardhana, when the Buddha did intervene to prevent death. But this happened only because the Buddha knew that there was sufficient karmic energy to sustain the present existence, which was in danger of being prematurely cut off. But in all other cases, the Buddha knew that the karmic energy for survival is almost completely exhausted, and in his compassion, he provided the opportunity for the person to be released from repeated existence. Note that the Buddha does not release a person from samsara. That can only be done by oneself. The Buddha only shows the way. In Buddhism, the continuance of existence is not the ideal. The attainment of Nibbana after the final death is considered the ultimate goal. Hence, dying after gaining full sanctity is not to be considered tragic or unfortunate. Realizing Dhamma through minor incidents. One may also be justified in wondering why certain trivial incidents were recorded, like the monks who complained to the Buddha that some others were making a lot of noise wearing clogs. They even went to the Buddha to ask why the ropes attached to a sand-filled cart gave way when pulled by the oxen. Characteristically, the Buddha used those incidents as a teaching point to explain a much more difficult concept. This shows the innocence of some of the monks and the Buddha's incomparable patience in listening to them and taking steps to remove the source of their irritation and ignorance. Further, we see that many monks were very simple, unsophisticated people who genuinely wanted to find answers to problems that troubled them. These may sound trivial to the intelligent, but they were certainly not trivial to the person who was troubled by the problem. And the Buddha was not one to ignore a genuine seeker after the truth. On the other hand, some intelligent monks also reported these trivial incidents to the Buddha because they knew how the Buddha would translate the incident to explain some profound truth in the Dhamma for the benefit of all. Invisible living beings. Then there is the problem of references to cave spirits, tree spirits, goblins, ogres, nagas, hungry ghosts, and so on. Those of us brought up with a purely materialistic or secular education will doubtless tend to sneer at the supernatural and deny the existence of invisible living beings. Here again we must be open-minded and admit that science is today just beginning to admit there are more things in heaven and earth. Until such phenomena can be completely proved or disproved scientifically, it may be best to accept that our knowledge of the universe is meager and is far from perfect. Miracles and religion. To the masses, a religion without miracles is inconceivable. Every religious book in the world records at least some instances of their founders' supernormal powers to effect miraculous cures, walking on water, appearing in two places at the same time, and so on. Buddhism also accepts the phenomenon of miracles, but with a marked difference. These powers are not divinely endowed. According to the Buddha, the performance of miracles is within the capacity of every human being who has developed his psychic powers through jhana meditation. Thus, the Arahants mentioned in the Dhammapada worked miracles. Moggallana multiplied the cakes, Chulapantaka projected multiple images of himself, Samanera Sona, although only 8, was able to create a monastery for the Buddha and his retinue, and Khema could fly through the air. The Buddha himself performed the twin miracles, emitted rays of light and water simultaneously from each nostril, generated 6 colored cosmic rays from his body, projected visions of himself, heard and understood the cries of insects, created a golden lotus and images of a beautiful woman turning old, dying, and decomposing. However, all these miracles were performed not to glorify a divinity, but to help people to understand the true nature of phenomena. There are many instances where the Buddha uses his supreme mental powers to will that things appear or disappear, so that his listeners can concentrate, or to make the questioners forget the question until the time for the answer is appropriate, and so on. Again, in all these instances, the Buddha only employs his supernormal powers to help human beings achieve their emancipation. He specifically instructed some of his monks to refrain from resorting to miracles simply to impress the gullible, remarking that this was like employing dancing girls to sell merchandise. Why renounce? In many Buddhist countries, it is considered a praiseworthy deed to turn one's back on the material world and join the order of monks. In the Dhammapada, we find many instances of a number of people, old and young, rich and poor, male and female, renouncing the worldly life. Although some people appreciate their desire for renunciation, some others may wonder whether it is not irresponsible and selfish to turn one's back on one's dependents and leave them in the lurch to fend for themselves. The Dhammapada records stories of parents, wives, and betrothed ones being left unhappy and miserable when those they love leave them to become mendicants. To discuss this problem, we must consider the Dhammapada verse which refers to those who do not yet understand the uncertainty of existence. I have sons, I have wealth. The ignorant man thinks he is secured. Indeed, he himself is not his own. How can sons or wealth be his? Bound to this world as we are by delusion, we create selfish desire which gives rise to attachment for others who we call our own. But if we only reflect that these very beings we claim as our own belonged to countless others in previous lives, and will again belong to others in future lives, we will see all our selfish craving for others as merely trying to grasp at mirages. Those who renounce do so for many reasons. There are those who become monks to lead an easy life, to join some loved one who has joined the order, to avert ill fortune, and so on. These are not genuine seekers after reality in life. However, those who genuinely seek to understand the purpose of life renounce when they truly comprehend the nature of existence in samsara. It is not escapism. They realize that real release from unsatisfactoriness can only be gained by cutting off all attachments. It is not selfishness but a sacrifice, because no one can renounce anything with selfishness. They may cause temporary grief to those who are attached to selfhood when they make the momentous decision to enter the homeless life. But each individual's emancipation is in his own hands. He will only delay emancipation if he clings to the worldly life. By oneself indeed is evil done. By oneself is one defiled. By oneself is evil left undone. By oneself indeed is one purified. Purity and impurity depend on oneself. No one purifies another. As Lady Patachara and Kisagotami realized, death will still separate us and our loved ones. The only emancipation is attaining Nibbana, where the illusion of self is irrevocably destroyed, and there is no more meeting through rebirth and separation through death. To do this, the first step must be made, and like a surgeon's incision, it may be painful, but necessary. For the sake of others' welfare, however great, let not one neglect one's own welfare, liberation. Clearly perceiving one's own welfare, let one be intent on one's own goal. Welfare here does not refer to one's own physical well-being, but one's spiritual emancipation, which can only be obtained by personal effort and renunciation. Dr. Anthony Fernando, lecturer in Christian culture in the University of Kelaniya, Sri Lanka, in his book Buddhism and Christianity, states, "A Christian student may be somewhat shocked at the idea of a married person leaving his wife and child behind to enter the monastic life. We must view such a happening in the light of the social traditions prevalent at the time. Leaving home for the practice of asceticism after a period of married life was an approved form of behavior in Hindu society. According to the Hindu ideal, a person aspiring for perfection had to organize his life in a certain gradation. He had first to be a celibate student, then a married man, and finally either an ascetic or a hermit. According to that commonly accepted tradition, Buddha's behavior was not at all abnormal. Further, if the Indian family system is taken into account, where a strong sense of unity prevails between relatives, leaving behind a wife and child did not amount to an abandonment. They were always taken care of by the parents, parents-in-law, or uncles and aunts. Those who sneer at the shavelings may go and worship and ask for their blessings as soon as their temporal means of happiness, wealth, loved ones, power are removed. True solace can only be found in the serenity of simple surroundings, simplicity in life, and among people who have given up craving. Those who are too strongly attached to the world of sensual desires cannot appreciate the relief that is experienced by the liberated ones who have finally cut off their worldly burdens. In the songs of the elders, Theravada, paeans of joy are uttered by the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis who express their ecstatic feelings at this indescribable experience of pure happiness. Others who have been inspired by them have also followed their path and experienced the same joy, which is permanent and indestructible, unlike the temporary gleams of happiness that we worldlings take for the real thing. It is after renunciation that people not only experience complete freedom in their lives, but can render better service to others. The only way to curtain greed, jealousy, and hatred, and other mental disturbances, in order to lead a peaceful life, is through renunciation. Arahanthood. Why do people go through so much effort to attain arahanthood or sanctification? It is because they understand the ultimate goal of a being according to the Buddha's teaching, which is to destroy, finally and utterly, the root cause of rebirth, which brings repeated sorrow and unsatisfactoriness, dukkha. There is no alternative to nibbana. Even rebirth in heaven is a temporary experience. Sooner or later, even the gods must die and continue to struggle in samsara. According to the Buddha, there is one way to liberation, nibbana, and another for the worldly life. Having experienced the worldly life, and having found it unsatisfactory, the one who understands gives up family, bondage, wealth, and power with no feelings of regret. About the Dhammapada. The Dhammapada, or the Words of Truth, consists of 423 verses in Pali, uttered by the Buddha on some 305 occasions for the benefit of a wide range of human beings. These sayings were selected and compiled into one book as being worthy of special note on account of their beauty and relevance for molding the lives of future generations of Buddhists. They are divided into 27 cantos or chapters, called Vagga, and the stanzas are arranged according to subject matter. The great commentator, Buddhaghosa, in the 5th century of Common Era, wrote voluminous notes on the traditional interpretations of the Pali verses and technical terms. He also added the stories about the circumstances in which the stanzas were uttered and the effect they had on the listeners. It is generally believed that most of these stories had been handed down orally for generations since the days of the Buddha. The first translation of the Dhammapada into a European language was carried out by the eminent Danish scholar Victor Fausboll in 1855. He translated the Pali text into Latin for the first time with notes and excerpts from the commentaries. The first German translation by Weber appeared in 1860, and the English translation by Max Muller in 1908. Besides the translation from the Pali text, English translations were also made from the ancient Chinese and Tibetan texts as early as 1878 and 1883. It may be noted that these texts were themselves translated from the original Pali and Sanskrit canons. Those with a mind to understand will gain much from the verses of the Dhammapada and the commentary. Those who are in search of a message of hope through love and wisdom will certainly find it in these ancient but ever fresh verses of the Dhammapada. Oliver Abhinayaka, senior lecturer in the Department of Pali and Buddhist Studies at the University of Kelaniya, Sri Lanka, in his book, A Textual and Historical Analysis of the Khuddaka Nikaya, says, the Pali Dhammapada contains 26 vaggas and 423 verses. The majority of verses are found in other canonical works, such as the Digha Nikaya, Majjhima Nikaya, Sangyutta Nikaya, Anguttara Nikaya, Udana, Itivuttaka, Thera and Therigata, Mahavagga and Chullavagga. The verses found in the Sangyutta Nikaya and the Theragata are frequently seen in the Dhammapada. The Milindapanya and Nettipakarana present a great number of Dhammapada stanzas. The parallel passages to the gathas that occur in the Dhammapada are found in the following Sanskrit texts: Maitreya, Brudaranayaka, Mahavastu, Divyavadana, Uttaradhyayana, Mahabharata, Manushmruti, and Jatakamala. The Dhammapada is a highly venerated and esteemed sacred book in Sri Lanka. It is customary to use this as a textbook for novices who are required to memorize by heart the verses of the Dhammapada from the beginning to the end, if not at least a few chapters before they can receive their higher ordination or upasampada. About this edition. This edition of the Dhammapada has been revised primarily for the benefit of modern readers who have not had the opportunity to read the original Pali version. When Pali words are Romanized, they are separated for easier pronunciation. Long names are also split into 2 or 3 parts for the same reason. The original stories have been rewritten to avoid lengthy repetitions and obscure references. Many unnecessary details have been deleted, while some remarks have been added to clarify certain points which may not be immediately clear to modern readers. However, every attempt has been made to ensure that the stories have not been distorted beyond recognition. Care has been taken to retain the original meaning of this valuable collection, which has reached us from the time of the Enlightened One himself. Readers who wish to avail themselves of more detailed versions of the stories are advised to read Buddhist legends, which contain fairly close translations from the Pali text. The main sources of references in English for this edition are as follows. 1. Venerable Narada's The Dhammapada, a translation published in 1963. 2. Dao Mia Tin, The Dhammapada Verses and Stories, a translation published by Burma Pitaka Association, Rangoon, in 1986. And 3. Burlingame, E.W., Buddhist Legends, 3 volumes, Harvard Oriental Series, reprinted by Polytext Society in 1979. The gems of truth embodied in these texts aptly illustrate the moral and philosophical teachings of the Buddha. One should not rest satisfied with a mere perusal of these golden sayings. They should be read, reread, and reflected upon, together with the accompanying stories, drawing appropriate lessons therefrom. These interesting and edifying anecdotes clearly depict the greatness of the Buddha as an energetic, compassionate, and wise teacher, ever ready to serve all. All these noble utterances can be cultivated with right effort and put into actual practice in the course of one's daily life. According to Venerable Narada, the Dhammapada is not a book to be read superficially like a novel and shelved aside. It should be read and reread so that it may serve as a constant companion for edification, inspiration, and solace in times of need. Then only one may rightly say, in the words of the Dhammapada, "Happily he lives who drinks of the Dhamma." K.Sri.Dhammananda, Buddhist Vihara, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, 30th of May, 1988, Vesak Day, Buddhist era, year 2531.